It's great to be here. I've learned a lot already. And yeah, speaking of Front Porch Republic, I think, is Seth still here? Anyway, somebody who's written for us is a member of this church, so it's fun to get down here and meet him. It's also good to be back in the state that has good barbecue, which Pennsylvania, not so much. I think some things I'm going to talk about hopefully will dovetail with what David and Bonnie have already talked about, and maybe spark some further conversation along the lines that they've already laid out. But I want to just begin by thinking about some of the fixes to misinformation or polarization that we often hear about as sort of, this is going to fix things. You know, maybe the feds can break up big tech, or maybe if we have this like new social media platform, people will somehow behave better on it. Or maybe if we have like labels on posts as misleading, or we ban certain political figures, then it will all be fixed. And all of these kind of technocratic fixes seem to be directed at the rider rather than the elephant, to go back to that distinction that John the Height makes. And I just want to suggest that the challenges posed by the digital public sphere and its deformative effects on our affections and on our thinking run so much deeper, right? And therefore, in order to participate redemptively in the public sphere as Christians, we can't wait for some engineers or some politicians to come up with some fix that will make us all good participants. Instead, we have to rethink Christian discipleship and be formed more deeply by healthy communities, and hope that the sort of directional arrow will then flow out to our participation on social media, but also more broadly in the public sphere. But throughout history, there have been a lot of these shifts in media technologies, right? You can think about the printing press, you can think about the telegraph in the 19th century, and now we're experiencing another one the last 10 or 15 years. And each time this happens, it's very disruptive, because each time this happens, our kind of communities are reoriented. You know, at my table, and David French talked about this, you know, so many of us the last 10 or 15 years have experienced like, well, I thought I was friends with these people, or I thought this is my community, and then it's being realigned, right? People I thought I had little in common with, I found out I have a lot in common with. So these shifts are so disruptive because they reshape our friend groups and our communities. And when we fail then to try to address them at the community level, we are participating in what Haidt likes to call the rationalist delusion, that we can just make these tweaks to our thinking technologies and our thinking practices and we'll fix the problem. And really the problem is a communal problem, and the fixes have to come on the communal level. So I'm going to look at a couple what I think are fine, maybe, but mostly misguided attempts to overcome hyperpartisan divides, and then look at a couple what might be more productive and lasting approaches to strengthen our communities so that they can then more redemptively participate in the public sphere and in creating news. So I want to begin with this idea of the digital media ecosystem and how it shapes us, if we're not really careful, into just being members of an atomized swarm. And when the public sphere was had a more marginal role in our lives, when it was just one source of identity among many others, often more important ones, family, our local community, maybe our ethnic group, our religious tradition, then the way the public sphere operates and the sort of communities it invites us into are less important. But part of what's going on is, as other forms of community and belonging erode, I mean, we've already heard some stats today about how many people have few or no friendships, right? Then we turn increasingly to social media to find community. And so the deformative effects of the public sphere become more toxic. And the result is that we don't replace other kinds of community with different kinds of community, we replace other kinds of community with just a swarm. But I'll just give you a couple more sort of pegs, I guess, to hang this increasing loneliness that we're experiencing. You know, when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, he talked about how we're obsessed with moral and intellectual associations, that there's this deep drive to join groups and to be parts of these civic organizations, and that no longer rings as true as it once did. You can think about Putnam's Bowling Alone, you can think about Tim Carney's Alienated America, that there's deep stress on our civic institutions, our civic society. And many individuals are kind of slipping through the cracks, and they're more estranged. I like the way that Robert Nisbet puts it in his classic study, The Quest for Community. He says that an individual who has become estranged, who has been alienated from civil society, not only does not feel a part of the social order, but he has lost interest in being a part of it. So there's these kind of radical free agents who are deeply lonely. And it's not just America. You know, I think we see this happening across, especially the educated West. Britain now has a minister for loneliness. I'm sure that will fix the problem. You know, maybe if we just had a cabinet position for minister of loneliness, that would help. So it's in this context, I think, that the pull of social media becomes really enticing, right? So people think, well, I have to watch Fox News, or I have to stay up with what's going on CNN, because that's the point of common connection that I have. That's where I can post on my Facebook, with my Facebook friends, and we can talk about these things. So shared attention to issues in the public sphere becomes the source of community for a lot of people, instead of you know, their workplace or local sports or church life. But the actual mediums through which these kinds of community take place are simply inadequate. And you know, I think there can be dangers in talking about digital media as an unprecedented situation, and this is all brand new. But again, we've seen this before. The printing press radically reoriented communities and broke them apart. And a scholar who has done a lot of work on that, Elizabeth Eisenstein, she points out that actually just the act of reading, rather than the act of hearing or conversing with people, is itself individuating. That as we read by ourselves silently, we are already beginning to withdraw from the people around us. You know, if you've read Confessions, Augustine has that famous passage where he describes Ambrose reading silently, and he thinks, what's going on? You know, is this okay? Is it okay to read quietly? Because in that era, you always read out loud. It was just the only way to read. But this is what Eisenstein writes about the shift to print. She says, even while communal solidarity was diminished, so you're withdrawn from your community that's at hand, vicarious participation in more distant events is also enhanced. Even when local ties are loosened, links to larger collective units were being forged. Printed materials encouraged silent adherence to causes whose advocates could not be found in any one parish, and to address an invisible public from afar. New forms of group identity began to compete with an older, more localized nexus of loyalties. This is happening in, you know, the 16th and 17th centuries. And then, of course, it happens a lot more with the internet and social media. But I think her description of these dynamics simply helps us recognize the ways that the public sphere is not conducive to forming the kinds of rooted communities that can hold us accountable, right? So we can disagree and be friends. So we know that we belong to these people even if we don't share their ideas. And we replace that with kind of affinity groups, right? I like these people because they have the right politics or because they like the right TV shows. But this kind of community that forms online, right, is a very different beast. The title of Sherry Turkle's book on how digital technologies change the shape of our communities is very apt, I think. She writes, we are alone together. So we're together, but we're all together in front of our screens. So it's a different kind of togetherness, we'll put it that way. And you only have to observe the behavior of online mobs to get a sense for how it is that digitally connected individuals can swarm around particular issues or stimuli. You know, there's a bit of news, there's an image, Some politician tweets out something that's poorly worded or outright stupid, and all of a sudden there's this like fierce feeding frenzy. And then hours, maybe a day later, it's totally forgotten. You're back on the memory, the attention span of a goldfish. The philosopher Zygmunt Bauman distinguishes such swarms from more traditional forms of community, and he writes that swarms tend to replace groups which have leaders, hierarchies, and pecking orders. Swarms, on the other hand, assemble, disperse, and come together again from one occasion to another, each time guided by different, invariably shifting relevancies and attracted by changing and moving targets. So swarms, they don't have an organization, they don't have division of labor, they don't have discrete and differentiated identities where like you have different roles, like the body of Christ, right, has different roles. Instead, each individual is a mere fungible, replaceable quantity. It's all about how many likes or retweets you can get, and each one counts as one. So when community happens in the digital public sphere, it's really not community, it's a swarm. And swarms, this kind of pseudo-community, you might say, that result when lonely, alienated individuals are looking for some way to replace that sense of community by fixating on various events of the day. But these collections of individuals just don't provide a sense of identity and belonging in the same way that a community does. You see this too, I think, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. If you remember back in the dark ages when Twitter was going to save democracy before it was going to destroy democracy, people had a lot of optimism that if we can just give people access to social media, democracy will abound and things. But what happens is, a lot of people involved in those movements wrote about how you can generate energy and get excitement really fast, but then you can't actually change anything because there's not a structure there where people trust and can work through disagreements, right? If there's any issue comes up, it just breaks apart. So swarms are great at like going viral, but they're terrible at doing anything. You might, this again, speaking of the dark ages, you might dump ice water on your head for ALS. You might, post something, have a hashtag, but then it just gets forgotten. So if you want to actually affect change about issues we care about, which as Christians we should, if you want to act justly, we can't do that in the public sphere. We can't do that as parts of a swarm. And then again, of course, as we've heard from Bonnie and from David, one of the problems with swarms is that they spread these kinds of partial truths or outright falsehoods in the interest of appealing to whatever fixation holds them together. And so they become agents, I guess, of spreading misinformation. So what do we do about this? And again, if we just address it on the level of the digital public sphere, that's where I think we're not really going to solve the problem. So I'll look at a couple of these inadequate fixes and then try to address the community level. I am encouraged. The fact that we're all gathered here today is a sign of this growing consensus that something's amiss, right? And that's a first step, so we should be encouraged by that. Essays, books, podcasts regularly bemoan the effects of polarization, the effects of social media and the result of hyperpartisanship, polarization. But so often, like I said at the beginning, we have these kind of inadequate fixes, namely fact-checking and diversifying our newsfeed, or just listening to a broader array of voices. So I'll just look at these real quick. Many news organizations have called for more fact-checking, and actually I think the Dispatch is part of Facebook's fact-checking network system. But Snopes has an entire business. There's an international fact-checking network. And I think well-intentioned, this is good. It's better to have fact checks than not, I suppose. But again, this is not really going to solve the problem for the exact reasons that Bonnie laid out regarding identitarian deference, right? We don't actually go out looking for information. We go out looking for, what are my people saying? Well, Jake Tapper said it must not be true. And it's helpful to think about these problems, I think, again, by returning to an earlier historical moment. So, mass propaganda, as we think about it today, maybe began in the the early 20th century with war propaganda, both World War I and then particularly World War II. And the lead up to World War II, there was a lot of concern about the spread of propaganda. And there's a really interesting essay written by Daniel Allen and Justin Pottle on the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, which was founded in the 1930s in America. And they were very concerned about the increasing role that propaganda was playing in shaping American public opinion. And if you, I'm just going to read from their press release. This is from 1930s, but just mentally swap out, Twitter for TV or Instagram for newsreel, and I think you'll see the similarities today. Nothing's really changed. They write, America is beset by a confusion of conflicting propaganda, a babble of voices, warnings, charges, countercharges, assertions, and contradictions, assailing us continually through press, radio, and newsreel. Today, there is a special need for propaganda analysis. If American citizens are to have a clear understanding of conditions and what to do about them, they must be able to recognize propaganda, to analyze, and to appraise it. And so the organization, again, like David talked about, they think, how can we address the writer? Right? How can we help people think about propaganda better? But they're missing the elephant. So they develop high school curriculum. They do all kinds of campaigns to teach media literacy. They try to do fact checking. But the problem is, and critics at the time noted this, like Lewis Mumford, their rubrics couldn't really distinguish between what FDR was saying or what Hitler was saying. And in part because anytime you have morally charged language, they're like, oh, it's propaganda. Well, Christians kind of need morally charged language, right? So it's not like you can just have objective, bare, neutral facts. I mean, think again about the three points that Bonnie ended with regarding truth. It's simple objectivity is not really the Christian position. So this is how Allen and Pottle conclude their sort of analysis of these failures. They write that the fact-checking or sort of rational approach represented by the IPA misses the fundamental difficulty of political judgment. Namely, that evidence or facts take on their meaning and significance under the color of particular commitments of principle. Key collective political judgments concern the just and the unjust, the advantageous and the disadvantageous, the admirable and the shameful. So again, this is not to say that we shouldn't do media literacy or we shouldn't do fact-checking, but simply that these things are addressing the symptom rather than the cause. This is why I think it's really helpful that NAP has named this the American Values Coalition, right? That it's fundamentally, we have to address this by recentering our commitments to core values. And that's a better approach than trying to educate people in media literacy or trying to just do fact checks. Yeah, so again, I will add one more point. So one corollary, I guess, or one kind of implication, maybe this is a thing we can discuss around the tables in a few minutes, is that misinformation thrives because of these underlying communal dysfunctions, right? And so we have to address those functions. So David French likes to make a distinction between enabling and precipitating lies. And sometimes we really zero in on the precipitating lies, right? About the election being stolen, or about some fact about the vaccines that you found on YouTube. But if we focus our efforts on precipitating lies, that is not really going to change the conversation, right? You just get in this kind of rabbit hole discussion, and if you've ever tried to have these conversations, they quickly devolve, I think, and people then become enemies, and no one's mind has changed. But if instead we focus on these enabling lies, these lies that foment alienation and loneliness, I think there's a much more chance to be effective. So, maybe if you hear somebody saying, that political party hates America, or these policies, or like what French was saying about the debate he had with Eric, where if Joe Biden's elected, we can't hold these events anymore. And if we just think, try to tone down the animosity and create the conditions for listening, that's going to be, I think, a more effective long-term strategy. So undermine the plausibility of the enabling lies maybe is more a more effective approach. Okay, the other inadequate solution is simply this idea of diversifying our newsfeed, or watching CNN and Fox, or MSNBC and Fox, which is a terrible idea, right? As Bonnie said, we need to unplug more, not plug in more. But and again, this comes from a good idea, right? The idea is that we inhabit an echo chamber or a filter bubble, and we only hear voices from people whom we already agree with, and so we're never getting the opposing side, and that's the problem. And there's some truth to this, right? Like Jacques Ellul, writing in mid-century, as the media landscape is beginning to fragment, identifies this problem like we're living in alternative realities, and we aren't even sharing the same discourse anymore. And of course, that has only become more the case since Ellul was writing in the 50s and 60s. But the irony is that there's been studies done on this now, and it has the exact opposite effect. There's a really interesting book out by Chris Bale from Duke Polarization Labs, and they did this experiment where they had people, they did surveys with people, and if you lean right, they make you follow, or have you follow this bot that retweets left accounts, and if you lean left, they have you follow a bot that retweets right politicians and pundits. And then they survey their political opinions and have kind of in-depth interviews before, and then they come back 6 months later and do it again. And the people and they do a control group too, right? And the people who were exposed to these other voices, their positions became more extreme. So if they lean left, after listening to Ted Cruz or whoever, Fox News people, they're like hardcore left. And if they lean right, and then they have to listen to AOC or other people on the left, they're like crazy right. So the effect is actually the opposite, right? Diversifying the voices you listen to on social media or the digital public sphere actually makes you more extreme. And this is, Zainab Tafouki, who's, I think, a really helpful thinker, someone who lived during, or was in Turkey, I think, during the Arab Spring era, writes that people who read news online already encounter a wider variety of opinion than those who don't. So you're already breaking the filter bubble, right, if you're online. The problem isn't so much your filter bubble as it is the shape and the kind of discourse that happens online itself. So this is Tafouki. She writes that when we encounter opposing views in the age and context of social media, it's not like reading them in a newspaper while drinking coffee. It's like hearing them from the opposing team while sitting with our fellow fans in a football stadium. Online, we're connected with our communities and we seek approval from our like-minded peers. We bond with our team by yelling at the fans of the other one. In sociology terms, we strengthen our feeling of in-group belonging by increasing our distance from and tension with the out-group. Us versus them. Our cognitive universe isn't an echo chamber, but our social one is. This is why the various projects for fact-checking claims in the news, while valuable, don't convince people. Belonging is stronger than facts. If you take one thing away that I say today, I take that, which is from Tafouki, but just this truth that belonging is stronger than facts, which is a very Christian notion, I think, that our communities shape how we think and what we believe. This is why Christian community, this is why Christ didn't come to give us a set of facts, he gave us his body. And that should lead us to try to address these problems that we're all well aware of, not on the level of the writer, not on the level of the public sphere itself, but on the level of community. What can we do to change the structure and improve the health of our communities so that we will be more resistant to these problems? And I'm just going to suggest kind of two things that hopefully will make us change the kind of people we are so that we can engage with these public sphere conversations in a way that's rooted in our fundamental commitment to loving God and loving our neighbors. And so the first is these practices of joining that would actually root our identity in embodied communities, and the second category would be practices or ways of participating in media that might counter its particular warping pressures, that might lead us to participate in a way that's not our in-group yelling at our out-group. So I think most fundamentally, this is a very I think, gospel-oriented idea that most fundamentally healing the tribalism that marks our media ecology is going to require us to take up what the theologian Willie Jennings calls the incarnational practice of joining, of moving into the neighborhood, as John 1 puts it. Sometimes this is going to be uncomfortable, right? We might have to cross racial or class or economic or educational or ideological divides to belong with our fellow Christians and with our neighbors, even while we still won't share the same perspectives or the same opinions. Jennings writes, in describing this idea of joining, he writes, "The space of communion is always ready to appear when the people of God reach down to join the land and reach out to join those around them, their near and distant neighbors." So if our communities have been marred, have been disfigured by exclusion or by not listening to people that don't look like us or don't think like us, we're going to have to change, right? We're going to have to find ways to listen. And I know COVID has made that more challenging, both logistically, but also, one of the results, unfortunately, of COVID is that a lot of churches became even more sorted ideologically, right? Maybe you change churches because you disagree with the masking policy or whatever. So it's unfortunately only gotten worse in the last couple of years. But finding ways to be in small groups with, move into neighborhoods with, do work alongside of people who don't agree with us is really fundamentally important to changing our posture toward the news. And that's why I think one of the great obligations, but also opportunities for churches and church leaders at this moment is to think more creatively about how we can encourage one another to love our neighbors and to be in communion with them. As more and more Americans are checked out of civic life, but are also feeling those losses, I think there's real opportunity for us to invite them back into communion. I was just talking to people at my table about Pray the City and this movement in Amarillo to work across denominational lines and cooperate on this. Sounds very exciting. So I think stuff like that is happening, and that represents a really, again, you may not think Pray the City will combat polarization, but I think that is striking at the root of the problem. So it's stuff like that it gives me hope. The second corollary, hopefully one of the outgrowths of this, would be that we could enter the public sphere in more fundamentally redemptive ways, so that we wouldn't just be, tweeting our way to save America one tweet at a time or something. That's like this. That's totally unimaginative, right? We'll just participate like they do. We have to participate differently. And again, this happens when the directionality of our allegiances are shifted. So instead of we come into our churches and we come into our neighborhoods as people with these ideological commitments, instead we go out into public spaces as people with these communal convictions. Is our belonging in the public sphere dictating our interactions with fellow church members, relatives, and neighbors? Or are we entering the public sphere on the basis of these commitments? For instance, just to give one example, sometimes debates around school masking policies or school curriculum, CRT issues, which happens at my school, it's really unfortunate because these debates are like driven by national discourse. And so people who work together and live together and have to sort these problems out can't have a conversation about the local issues. Like what should we have in our curriculum that would make sense for this community? Instead, they have to have a shouting match that takes place, filtered through Twitter. So it's really makes the problem unsolvable and it is bad. So instead, how can we belong to one another and then learn to work these issues out in conversation rather than just online? Yeah, so I think the key question here is who are we imagining ourselves as members of, right? And if we're imagining ourselves as I'm part of this Facebook group, or I'm imagining myself as this part of this ideological tribe, then that's going to shape our interactions with our neighbors. Whereas hopefully we can post on social media as a member of this family, as a member of this church, as a member of the city. So such belonging, I think, would reshape both how we read the news and then also how we might post or ourselves speak into the public sphere. And I want to just give this one example from one of my favorite authors, Wendell Berry, who's a Kentucky farmer. And he writes this poem called To a Siberian Woodsman during the Vietnam War, during the midst of the Cold War. And he's reading in National Geographic, I think, about, Russia. And there's this whole set of pictures about a Siberian woodsman. And Barry's poem, you can look up online afterwards if you're interested. It's a beautiful poem trying to respond to these images not as a representative American whose country is at war with this person's country, but as a member of his place, as a father himself, trying to respond and think about this father. He writes, he imagines himself here in Kentucky as a father and a farmer, reading about another father who, like himself, fishes with his son, eats with his family, works in the woods, and delights in the beauty of the forest. So because both Barry and this imagined Siberian woodsman belong to their respective places, they actually have a lot in common, even though they live in very different parts of the world under very different political regimes. And so Barry asks in this poem, who has invented our enmity? Again, Barry's commitments to his place don't lead him to apathy or to opt out of the public sphere. It's not a withdrawal like David talked about at the end. Instead, his participation in that space is shaped by his love for his neighbors and his theological convictions, in this case regarding pacifism. And it's because he's speaking from these commitments that his poem works against the very grain of the public sphere that it participates in. So this is just one example of a long tradition of Christians. I think there's a lot of good examples here, seeking to enter the public sphere while remaining firmly rooted in their theological and local communities. The best Christians who responded to the innovation of the printing press, or the radio, or social media, or podcasts, right, are thinking not how can I just adopt this business people or those trying to go viral, but how can I adopt this in a distinctively Christian fashion? And that's another reason why I'm encouraged, because recent years have not been good to the media, right? The media has suffered economically in a lot of other ways. But on the other hand, there is this proliferation of small websites, community newsletters, podcasts, small magazines. The Dispatch is certainly one example, but there's a lot of others. Oftentimes they're regionally rooted, so I'm not an expert on Amarillo's scene. But I think that's a really promising development, that instead of big media where there's 3 main TV stations that everyone listens to, maybe this kind of diversity of voices is actually an opportunity for Christians to participate redemptively. So, sometimes people have this kind of nostalgia for 1950s America when, the TV was great or something. Maybe it was, I was not alive then. But 1950s America maybe shouldn't be our goal. We shouldn't want a bland, monochromatic public discourse. The answer to toxic communities that form in the digital spaces is redemptive Christian communities. John Askanos and Ari Schulman recommend it this way. They say, rather than hoping for the restoration of a universalized intellectual culture, we would do better to ratify and manage the reversion to separate communities and to build institutions that encourage tribalism's more fruitful expressions. Rather than shoving all our debates into a single hellish town square, let each town have its own square, and let us work to make each a place of fruitful exchange. So I think it's that kind of vision, what kind of small communities of discourse can we encourage and build? I think that's a really helpful question. That's what motivates me in my work with Front Porch Republic. I think that's the basic vision behind the Dispatch. There's a lot of interesting Christian organizations not trying to take over the public sphere, but to labor along the margins, as it were, of this broken system, to inspire and build community, to let people think, oh, there are sane people out here. You're not alone. Here are some things you can be reading and thinking about that will encourage you as you seek to go back to your family, to your church, to your community, and try to be a voice of sanity and redemption there. And so participating in those kinds of online communities might shape our intuitions, might shape our elephants, so that we're more likely to respond to stories and events with love rather than outrage, prayer rather than bitterness, and the kind of action, right, rather than just fear or apathy. So I would just leave you with this other suggestion. If subscribing to a paper or listening to a TV show or a podcast or some other kind of media, is a formative liturgy, if it's shaping our elephant at a fundamental level, then maybe we should try to subscribe aspirationally and listen to the voices that we want to sound like. Who are the people, again, maybe I don't agree with them on some issues, on a lot of issues, but who are the people who are talking in a way that sounds distinctively Christian? Who are the people who are modeling a kind of Christian posture in the public sphere? Because you'll catch that attitude, right? And if you listen to the loud, crazy voices, then you'll catch that attitude. If you listen to people who tell you to be afraid, you will be afraid. So again, participating in these kind of smaller communities won't magically fix, right? They aren't scalable in the way that we sometimes want things to be. This is why, David ended on this note, right? It might not work, but the whole Christian gospel is rooted in this crazy paradox that Christ, G.K. Chesterton says, the cross looks like defeat, but it's victory, right? And it's that paradox, I think, that should govern us here too. We don't have to try to make things work on the world's terms because we have confidence elsewhere. So I guess I would just invite you to then, around your tables, to look at this question that I put on your packets, and to talk with one another about how local churches or other organizations or nonprofits might invite Christians to belong more fully and thus be shaped more profoundly by embodied communities, right? How can we invite people into healthy communities that will reshape their affections and reshape then hopefully their involvement in the public sphere? Thanks.